My tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Wherever I go, to that place I know it'll always be home, home to me.
This is the Detroit River, 400 meters wide. It is one of the narrowest crossings on the Great Lakes system. Out there is the division line, mostly invisible, the Canada-US border. Through time, crossing the river has been a matter of economic opportunity or political allegiance. It has also been a hole in the wall for the criminal faction, and by contrast, a gateway to freedom for others. Situated on this river is Windsor, Ontario. At our front door, it is a microcosm of Canada. Describing the history of this community is to describe the history of our nation. The archives of the border region read like a Reader's Digest of Canadian history. Existing are the social, cultural influences of France and Britain, and by its proximity, the pronounced economic impact of our U.S. neighbor. But some anomalies do exist. In latitude, Essex County is comparable to Rome or Northern California. And how about this for a change? From here, we look north to our American cousin. It is a tale of two cities. In the beginning was Sir de Cadillac's outpost of Detroit. Historian Alan Douglas.
This particular site was chosen because of the narrowness of the river at this spot. It's roughly one cannon shot wide, and so this seemed to be an ideal spot not only to seal off navigation, but also as a crossing point. This is, in fact, the best crossing point in the entire Great Lakes system. Detroit had its origins as a fur trading center. Most of the fur trade took place in the upper Great Lakes and used the connecting route by way of the Ottawa River down to Montreal. But the post here along the Detroit was seen as a sort of granary to supply the fur trade in the upper Great Lakes. So it was primarily an agricultural settlement and secondarily a fur trading settlement.
At the wilderness crossroads of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Basin, in the heartland of North America, the Detroit outpost was 7 weeks' travel to Montreal in summer, and in winter, frozen isolation. Even during the 1700s, the value of waterfront land led to a sectioned patterning, which would influence future development on both sides of the waterway.
The surrounding country was laid out in ribbon farms, strip farms, the French-Canadian, the classic surveying pattern that you see in Quebec along the shores of the St. Lawrence. And that pattern was laid out first on what is now the American side, and then by the middle of the 1700s, it expanded across to what is now the Canadian side of the river in the Windsor area.
By the mid-18th century, with settlement appearing in what is today the land of the maple leaf, a tradition of trade and commerce was established between north and south neighborhoods.
Some of the early travelers through the area, leaving descriptions behind of what they encountered here, remarked that the Detroit River, particularly the upper end of it, looked like the main street of a village. You would have the river down the center as a sort of canal with houses on either shore, and then the orchards behind the houses on either shore. And so that it certainly looked like a sort of rural wilderness Venice.
Although the British conquest of 1760 brought little change, the close of the American Revolution witnessed the division of the two ideals. Fort Detroit was now on American soil. The concentration of the British and French centered around the newly created towns of Amherstburg and Sandwich on the Canadian shore. Through the events of 1812 and the Rebellion of '37, the Detroit frontier could be likened to adjoining backyards of the two emerging nations. The isolation and difficulty of communication with the outside world was a very real obstacle to settlement and trade. Alone in the center of a continent, this shared vulnerability bound the Detroit River family. Today, millions of people and billions of tons of trade goods find their way by bridge, tunnel, and rail ferry through this gateway to Canada every year. The border region broke the chains of isolation with the coming of the railway in 1858. She then starred in the Industrial Revolution that put the world on wheels. The cradle of settlement in North America had become the mother of the automobile industry. Its founding fathers, Pontiac and Cadillac, were commemorated in chrome and steel. The age of enterprise was hers. To bustling Detroit in 1838 came a young man from Massachusetts. He served an apprenticeship and then opened a grocery store. But his sense of business adventure soon led him to this side of the river, where he built a distillery. That modest beginning was the foundation of his own empire.
By George, Mac, I believe you're right. We've hit it at last.
Hit it? I tell you, we've got it.
Why, that's the best distillation I ever saw.
We followed your instructions, sir, to the letter.
But can you do it again, Mac?
We'll do our best, sir. But you can't always tell about these things.
I know, Mac. What makes some mash ferment one way and some another?
You might as well try to control nature.
Mac, that's it. That's it.
What's it?
Nature control. We'll keep on till we find out how to make equipment that'll control nature for us in distilling. Every step of the way.
As he promised in that early portrayal, Hiram Walker would nurture his company every step of the way until his death 40 years after its start. These ornate surroundings speak of his success. As Al Milne tells it, it is a story of chance and irony, of the solitary man. Walker was known never to touch a drop himself, and he insisted on keeping the smallest office on the premises.
He was what we would now call a workaholic. He just worked and worked, and very, very ambitious, innovative. And when he got to the distilling side of the story, he really changed the industry in North America. He came over here in 1858. The reason he came to Canada was there was a form of prohibition in Michigan going on at that time, and you were never sure how long your distiller's license would be in effect. So he took the safe way out and bought about 400 acres on the Ontario side of the Detroit River. The railroad had just come in at that time, so he was pretty well located. If you wanted whiskey in those days, Harvey, you went down to the grocery store and you took a jug and they poured it out of a barrel. And the batches changed from day to day. It was good and bad. he was able to come up with a consistent, good whiskey. The same recipe day after day after day.
So he eliminated rot gut and red eye and that kind of stuff.
And the next thing he did was he put it in bottles. He was aiming at a very good grade of whiskey, and the most popular audience at that time, the marketplace, would be men's club, and they could afford the best, and he wanted to supply it to them. And so he called it club whiskey. He also hired a salesman. He was the first distiller ever to do that, to take the whiskey out of his own territory in North America. And it became very popular in the United States. And the Kentucky people said, you know, this is getting out of hand. And they went to Congress and they said, this man is selling whiskey that he claims is American whiskey. It's not, it's made in Canada. And he ought to put the country of origin on there. And Walker happily obliged and put Canadian in front of club. Mm-hmm. And of course, it just rocketed from there on.
Hiram Walker was the first in a series of large-scale industries to take root here. And for 130 years, this operation has continued to be the longest ongoing manufacturer. And through all of this, Walker didn't live here, did he?
No, he didn't. Walker was as American as apple pie. He was born on the 4th of July. And once he had this place built, he established a ferry service to Detroit so he could commute and still make a little money on the ferry.
Written on the sidewalks of today, the Walker legacy. The Windsor neighborhood is still referred to as Walkerville by its residents. Much of what still remains, the buildings, from his own bank to the post office, had to be stamped with Walker's approval, or it wouldn't be. For Al Roach, who grew up here, this saga is as intriguing as any.
Walkerville was a company town. Hiram Walker owned it. He provided the police force, the fire department, the waterworks, the streetlights, everything. It was incredible. One of the Detroit papers called it the queerest place in Christendom. There's a little story back at St. Mary's Church down here. We'll go back a little bit. Hiram Walker provided a church for the town of Walkerville in 1871. And the people voted for it, and they voted to have a Methodist congregation in a town built by whiskey. Hiram Walker apparently had a little conversation with the nice new minister who came from Toronto, and they had an agreement that he wouldn't mention whiskey after all. On the first Sunday, he forgot the agreement and spoke about the Devil's Brew, and on Monday morning, he was back on a train heading for Toronto.
By the 1860s, there was unrest along the border. As tension mounted toward the American Civil War, the largest freedom movement ever to be witnessed in North America was underway. Ill-prepared, desperate, thousands traveling by foot to escape human bondage. Using the heavens as their compass, one star personified hope. Brian Walls is a Windsor dentist who has clung to the meaning of his family's homestead out in Essex County. Brian, your great-great-grandfather lived in North Carolina, was a slave. When he launched himself onto what was then known as the Underground Railway, did he know where he was going to end up?
Not really. All he knew that if he followed the side of the tree the moss grows on in the light of the North Star, that he would eventually make it to Canada. According to Aunt Stella, who was the great of our family, who passed away at 102 years of age, she said that they would run through the woods by night and hide by day and kneel down at times and drink from the hoof prints of cattle in order to quench their thirst for freedom and continue along their perilous Underground Railroad journey to Canada. In other words, freedom was the essence of the motivating force that was behind them.
When they came across the Detroit River, why didn't they settle along the river shore? Why did they come 20 miles inland?
Well, one of the reasons that my great-great-grandfather came in, along with the fact that the abolitionists had set this parcel of land up, along with other areas for the refugees, was the fact that he was afraid of slave catchers coming across, as they did do, you know, cross the Detroit River to Sandwich and to Windsor and so on.
It is estimated that of 4 million slaves, only 10% reached freedom. It was unrivaled as an era of tragedy and deprivation. But they found their glory. It's hard for me to stand here and think that Aunt Stella conducted prayer services with that piano here in this room.
One of the things that she passed along to us is it's only what you do for Christ that will last. And on that piano, they would plunk and play Swing Low, Sweet Chariot and sing about the good times and the future times that they hoped would be even better.
The community of today has inherited an inventory of architecture that had announced the new commercial focus of the city of Windsor by the turn of the century. From the amalgamation of the towns of Sandwich, Walkerville, and this area that was once called Detroit South, the hub of activity on Willette Street evolved from the ferry service, which linked Woodward Avenue in Detroit's downtown. Along Ferry Street, the Windsor Castle was a 3-story hotel, the local hangout where international debate took place. They would talk about Captain Lebrun's record run of 26 minutes in the Essex, or Henry Ford's new manufacturing plant. They envisioned what it would be like when the underwater tunnel, eventually to be built in 1929, meant never having to leave your Tin Lizzie while you crossed the river. Imagine. Well, it wasn't long before the real issue of the day came up. Just when the boys were coming home from the war, the Anti-Saloon League was talking about drying up America. Opportunity calls, they said. We'll set up a new enterprise along the waterfront that will be sure to satisfy our good neighbors' thirst. We'll call it the Windsor Detroit Funnel. From 1916 to 1933, traffic in liquor was a major underground industry here. With prohibition in effect in the United States, this narrow crossing was an easy challenge for the bootleggers. They became the key suppliers to the organized gangs in the U.S. in a mad season of lawlessness. It is believed that 2/3 of the illegal liquor pumped into the United States during Prohibition came from Canada, and most of it across the Detroit River here. The age of speakeasies and flappers is unmatched in the history of the border cities. If you weren't selling or drinking it, you were campaigning against it. Marty Gervais has recorded many of the memories.
Everyone in this area was involved in Prohibition to some extent. You had the auto manufacturers producing false gas tanks, you know, to facilitate, you know, the carrying of contraband alcohol. You had special gunny sacks that were being manufactured. You had junk dealers selling old cars for $10 so that they could be loaded up with whiskey and taken across on the ice across the Detroit River. And the whole point of that was if they lost the car, that would be fine. The alcohol would float. You know, the booze would float in these gunny sacks in most cases. You had mothers taking bourbon, you know, the best Canadian bourbon, and shoving it underneath the babies' carriages and carrying, you know, going on the ferry boat across the river. Shipments of eggs were going across at a phenomenal rate. and they discovered that someone was using hypodermic needles, and actually, like, they would somehow get the yolk out of it and insert whiskey into it. And the Border City Star ran a kind of satire on this thing called fresh Canadian eggs laid by Canadian Club hens.
There must be some interesting stories involved with well, I don't know whether I should say it with you or not, but rum running across the river. It's only a couple hundred yards across the river here to go over to Detroit.
You must understand, Harvey, that was before my time.
Oh, of course, I understand that.
I think during those years we were in the export business. And
you dealt with an exporter.
We dealt with an exporter, and he would order, and we'd put the merchandise on the dock, and he would take care of it. He generally was going to Havana, somewhere like that, and he was generally back in half an hour if all went well.
My mother would never let me rent a rowboat after dark because these rum runners really ran on the water, and they had very powerful, beautiful mahogany boats inboards, and they'd cut you in half. They were running without lights because they were avoiding the Detroit patrol boats. And I'm standing approximately where the old Hiram Walker sign was. It was a beautiful sign. It had 4,300 bulbs. It was green and white and red, and it said Distillers of Canadian Club Walkerville. And I feel that has a role in rum running. I leave little to your imagination, but this was a dark river, and that sign, I'm sure, didn't hurt when the rum runners were trying to find their way into shore around here.
If only it could speak. What grand stories this river could tell. Of the emergence of two cities, two nations. Along the border, the variances and the similarities between Canada and the United States merge. Surfacing, though, something felt rather than seen are the subtle differences that separate us, that emerge more clearly having traced the story back through time. Time witnessed by this one common neighbor. If only it could speak.